Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 36, Sparta. Once upon a time, or so the story goes, an old man was searching for a place to sit during the Olympic Games. As usual, it was a packed house, and while he hobbled through the different areas struggling to find a seat, the crowd hurled insults at him for causing a distraction. This continued on until the old man reached the section of the Spartans, who upon seeing him approach all got up to offer him a seat, even those older than him. The crowd took notice of this and applauded, but the old man turned to them, shaking with tears in his eyes, and spoke. "Alas for the evil days, because all the Greeks know what is right and fair, but the Spartans alone practice it." This episode is all about Sparta. What is it about this place that still captures the imagination nearly 3,000 years later? Is it admiration for their warriors, fighting as one, choosing death over surrender? Is it their simple values, embracing a modest life? Or is it their progressive views towards women? After all, Sparta was the only Greek city to require academic and physical education for girls. Maybe it's a bit of everything. But as we reflect upon the roots of Sparta, keep in mind what lies at the center of this society. The idea of Sparta, the very concept of everything Spartan society is, revolves around one unavoidable truth: slaves. Now, they are by no means the only slave-owning society in the world. After all, this is ancient history. Slavery is an inescapable fact of life. It's common, rampant, and completely acceptable. Even high and mighty Athens has no qualms about owning slaves. But Sparta really took it to new levels, instituting a brutal, oppressive system designed to eliminate all traces of a slave's humanity, reducing them essentially to draft animals. So then, let's start right at the top, namely the founding of the current Sparta. If you don't have access to a map right now, picture the southern part of Greece, the Peloponnese, in your head. It sort of looks like a dinosaur foot, with the 4 claws pointing towards the south, and the heel pointing sort of northwest. Now between the 2 middle claws, there is a river, the Eurotas, that travels through the fertile Laconian plain, and about 25 miles north of where the river empties into the sea is where Sparta sits proudly. There used to be a Mycenaean Sparta, of course, back in the legendary times of Atreus and Menelaus, but since the Dorians swept in almost 400 years ago, those days are long gone. By the 8th century BC, the descendants of those Dorians, living in 4 villages near the river, joined together to form the polis, or city-state of Sparta. This Sparta went through the same land and food problems as the other Greek polises, but instead of choosing colonization, as so many other cities did, the Spartans chose the path of conquest. Why start from scratch when you can just take what you want? Their first target was the rest of Laconia, all land to their south, mostly inhabited by farming villages and towns. The Spartan army was still young and their soldiers were not yet the awesome fighting force they would eventually be, but these villagers were no match for them. This land now belonged to Sparta, who proceeded to divide those living there into 2 classes, both subordinate to Spartan citizens. Those fortunate enough to live closer to Sparta became known as periokoi. They were allowed to remain free and own land, however they were also required to serve in the Spartan army and had no voice in the government. The rest became known as the helots, slaves that were, in the words of the Spartan poet Tyrtaeus, like donkeys suffering under heavy burdens, they lived under the painful necessity of having to give their masters half the food their plowed land bore. Serfs, vassals, thralls, whatever you want to call them, they were conquered Greeks owned by the city, controlled by the government, whose lives had only one purpose: growing food for their new overlords. The helots didn't actually own the land they worked on. A Spartan aristocrat did, and they came with the property. And in exchange for getting to keep their lives, the helots had to pay a rent of half their annual crop. Sounds fair. And free from having to work the fields, the Spartans could dream of even greater conquests, namely to the west and the plains of Messenia. This region contained some of the best soil in Greece, as well as wealthy and established cities and towns. The Messenians were also the descendants of the Dorian invaders, although the Spartans could care less about that. Their neighbors have enjoyed freedom for too long. The Spartans attacked but were unable to achieve the same easy victory as they had before. The Messenians were far stronger than the Laconian villagers, and the Spartans hadn't perfected their military tactics. It took 20 years to successfully subjugate the region, with traditional dating identifying 720 BC as that year. As with before, some people became periokoi, usually those of high status, but the majority were now helots. As a side note, 20 years away from home is an awful long time, and while the men are out roughing it up, what are the women supposed to do? Now, famous in Greek literature is Penelope, wife of Odysseus, who remained faithful to him for the same amount of time, 2 decades, even while he was canoodling with exiled sorceresses. She is truly an inspiration. Maybe for other Greek women. Spartan women refused to put their love lives on hold, and with no proper Spartan men to stand in, the women turned to the helots and the periokoi for a little role in the hay. Of course, when the Spartan men returned home, you can imagine their surprise to find a whole new generation of Spartans waiting for them. But these bastard children, dubbed Parthenae, were cast out around 706 BC, and sent to start up Sparta's only colony, a town in southern Italy called Taras, now modern-day Toronto. At least, that's the most common account of how it got set up. Taras maintained a close relationship with her mother city, and would eventually grow to be a powerful force of its own. But in the beginning at least, its chief role was as an exile destination, for any helots or periokoi getting too big for their britches. At the beginning of the 7th century, Sparta had successfully expanded its territory and added a significant new population of helots to the state, all ready to toil away. Except the Spartans failed to consider that the Messenians, who had their own distinct culture and identity, enjoying nearly 400 years of liberty, wouldn't really be okay with this. Nearly 40 years after the culmination of the First War in 685 BC, new hostilities were initiated as the region went into total revolt. It would take another roughly 20 years before Sparta was able to re-establish control over Messenia, exiling potential but still useful troublemakers to Taras and executing military leaders. This final victory had made Sparta the largest of the Greek states, but it had also shown them a disturbing situation. In a land where disgruntled angry slaves outnumbered Spartans nearly 7-1, the potential for another uprising could come at any time. The only surefire way to prevent this was through compassionate emancipation. No. The only way to combat this threat is twofold. 1. Develop a state-sponsored system of humiliation and violence towards the helots to keep them in a constant state of fear and oppression. 2. Create the world's first army of elite professional soldiers, men born for war, each one the product of a society that expects nothing of him but military service, their only obligation to fight and, to quote the famous phrase, come back with their shield in victory or on it. For the helots, they were forced to wear animal skin clothing and funny hats, either made of leather or dog skin. The translation's a bit weird on that one. And to remember how meaningless their lives were, annual beatings were implemented in addition to religious holidays where murdering helots was allowed without reprisal. As well as the whole turning over half your harvest thing, helot men were forced to serve in the Spartan army, albeit as slingers or some other low, easy-to-kill position, while the women could be used as wet nurses or domestic staff. Basically, it doesn't get any worse than being a helot. Toiling in a hot field day after day until some jacked-up teenager looking to impress his bros shows up at your house and stabs you to death, and then gets a reward for doing so. Yeah, the worst. But it wasn't always like that. In fact, much of what we consider to be Spartan society, the seriousness, the austerity, the militarism, comes from the mind of one man, the great Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus. Some historians have him coming to power after the first Messenian conflict, maybe at the top of the 7th century, while Greek sources place him even earlier, possibly 9th century or before that. Also that he might have been a god, or demigod, trifling details really. Regardless of when he lived, or if he lived at all, the Spartans absolutely believed he did, and reforms credited to him were in place by the end of the 7th century. The story goes that Lycurgus saw a Sparta that had lost its way from the noble example of the Homeric heroes. It's not that the people were weak, but they needed discipline and strong leadership. After receiving a declaration of approval from the oracle at Delphi, called the Great Rhetra, Lycurgus and 30 of his supporters marched into the Spartan marketplace in full armor, ready to challenge anyone unwilling to accept his changes. He wasn't really going to fight anyone. Lycurgus knew the value of a bit of theater, and the message was well received. No one challenged him, and even the current king of Sparta joined Lycurgus in the revolution. First of his reforms was to shake up the government. Sparta would be unique for having two kings to ensure that the city was never without a leader. They were the religious, political, and military heads of the state, and while equal in authority, also served as a check against one another gaining too much power, a common fear in the Greek world. Below them was the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, men over 60, who along with the kings voted on matters of the state, discussed ideas, and meted out judicial punishments. Induction into this group was made after a previous member had died, and was not by how many votes you got, but by who received the loudest shouts. The person who could turn the Gerousia into a screaming match would be rewarded with the highest honor a Spartan citizen could achieve. Problem is, this system tends to lend itself to cronyism and oligarchy, which, that's probably what Lycurgus wanted all along. Well, I still like what Aristotle has to say about this. The mode in which Spartans elect their elders is childish. The worthiest should be appointed, whether he chooses to or not. Below the Gerousia were the ephors, 5 men over the age of 30 elected for an annual term. They advised the kings on legislative issues and even had the power to impeach them, should they break the laws. The ephors were also responsible for overseeing the only secret police force known to the Greeks, called the Crypteia. Young and ambitious Spartan men were recruited into this shadowy group with the one purpose of identifying troublesome helots and killing them with impunity. Volunteering for this group was the only way to guarantee advancement to the top levels of Spartan society. Lastly, at the bottom of the government, but by no means last in power, was the Apella, or assembly. This included all male citizens over 30 who met once a month outside during a full moon. This is where the Gerousia presented new laws to be voted on, although the Apella did not debate these proposals, just a vote. A Spartan was taught to always be deferential to their elders. Probably would have been beneficial to see a little critical thinking going on, but it certainly is a more civil way of doing things. Okay, government sorted out, next on to the people. For starters, Lycurgus cancelled all debts, and, have you ever realized how many times already we've seen new leaders come in and cancel personal debts? If anybody wants to pass that info on to our politicians, my student loans would really thank you. Anyway, Lycurgus cancels debts and divides all land in Laconia into equal parcels to be doled out to Spartan citizens, to show that all are equal. Any helots who lived on this land worked for their new masters, although they were technically still property of the state. Next on the checklist, it's time for Spartans to start living more, Spartan. Houses and furniture must be built and finished using nothing more than an axe and saw. Keeping everything plain and rough and having everyone follow this rule ensured that no one could be jealous of another's wealth. And speaking of wealth, Lycurgus banned the use of gold and silver as currency. Instead, he replaced it with the true source of Sparta's strength, iron. Sparta had some of the best iron mines in Greece, and while great for weapons, bulky, heavy iron ingots made for difficult shopping. Of course, the point here is that who would do business in a country that rejects gold and silver? Who would steal from someone whose money is worthless? And in turn, the Spartans were unable to purchase any luxury goods from foreign lands. As Plutarch records, merchants sent no shiploads into Laconian ports, no fortune teller, no harlot monger, or gold or silversmith or jeweler set foot in a country which had no money. So that luxury deprived little by little of that which fed and fomented it, wasted to nothing, and died away of itself. The last of his reforms, and the hardest to accept, was the introduction of communal mess halls. All citizens were required to eat together, even the kings and elders. This was intended as the ultimate notion of an equal society, but there was early outrage at this. A young aristocrat was so horrified at the thought that he chucked a stone at Lycurgus, blinding him in one eye. But the lawgiver was apparently a fair and calm man, who even convinced his attacker to join and accept this new institution. But suppose this carried on today. Imagine that it's illegal to have dinner by yourself, in the privacy of your own home. That every day, right around supper time, you'd have to physically get yourself to the local cafeteria to eat with total strangers, or else you could be arrested. This is why, as one ancient visitor to a Spartan mess hall from the colony of Sybaris reported, "Now I know why the Spartans do not fear death." Yes, well, if only this visitor knew the whole truth behind why the Spartans did not fear death. Because the never being alone for dinner thing is a piece of cake compared to the grueling and brutal educational system of Spartan boys, the agogia. All newborn boys were examined by members of the Gerousia. If they were found to be weak or sickly, they were left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. At the age of 7, the boy was taken from his home to train in groups called herds to get the child used to working in a unit. Early education focused on enduring pain and hardship, going barefoot to toughen feet, not being allowed to sleep, withholding food and water, all situations that could occur as soldiers. At 12, the boy had his hair shaved and given a single red cloak per year. This would be the boy's only clothing and blanket. He would sleep on a self-constructed scratchy mat of pulled reeds and was permitted to take a cold bath twice a year on religious occasions. His food was a simple black porridge, intended to keep him alive, but barely. Spartan boys were encouraged to supplement their meager rations by taking whatever they wanted from the helots. Stealing and murdering to acquire food and supplies was acceptable, unless you got caught. If that happened, you could be severely whipped, not as punishment for your crimes, but for getting caught. A similar scene also occurred during the annual games at the altar of Artemis Orthia, a Spartan cult dedicated to the hunting goddess. Young contestants had to brave their way through a force of older youths carrying whips, guarding the ultimate prize, cheese. As the boys rushed past the guards, they were expected to take the whippings without uttering a sound and to splatter blood on the altar. Needless to say, it wasn't uncommon for some to die during this festival, all for cheese. Between 14 and 20, Spartan boys participated in military service, forging even closer bonds with the same group they had been raised in. At 20, the Spartan was permitted to start growing his hair long, as well as the traditional beard. Not the style you saw in 300, but, well, pretty similar to what the Amish wear. A long, full beard with no mustache. Which is kind of ironic because the Amish intentionally don't grow a mustache because it's associated with war. Someone should say something. And between 20 to 30, a Spartan was permitted to marry, but he still had to live with his herd until 30, at which point, if he had done everything correct and hadn't snapped under the pressure, he was now a Spartiate, a member of Spartan society. A hard, tough life, and if you didn't cut it, you would be forced to shave your beard and wear clothing that identified you as a coward or a failure. But that's all for the boys. What about the girls? As Sparta was the only Greek state to require education for its fairest citizens, they were ahead of their time. Girls were not examined at birth, nor left to die on a mountain somewhere, but were trained in athletics and taught how to read and write. They could even own land and divorce their husbands freely and legally. As the Helots took care of the farming, Spartan women were not expected to perform any domestic activities, except one very important task. Make babies. Proper Spartan babies. This might sound like women were viewed as nothing more than baby factories, but that's far from the case. In a society where there are so few desired people, childbearing Spartan women were treated with respect and honor. Childbirth was comparable to the men's military obligation, and in fact there were only 2 ways to get your name on a gravestone in Sparta. The first was to die in battle. The second was to die in childbirth. Both were seen as the ultimate sacrifice. Now in the mid-6th century, Sparta was by far the strongest power in Greece, but expansion of the state had stopped. Looking north, the Spartans pursued a policy of alliance with their neighbors. Elis in the west agreed after the Spartans freed them from a tyrant who had seized control of the Olympic Games. In Corinthia, another tyrant was expelled. Arcadia was given a choice, join or die. They chose to join. But the region of Argolis, where the powerful city of Argos sat, was not included in this new alliance. Argos had earned the animosity of the Spartans earlier in the 7th century when the 2 cities locked horns, and Sparta would not forget this grudge. This union of Sparta and its allies, also called the Peloponnesian League, was formed under the premise of mutual defense, with Sparta at the reins. They would band together in war and seek out similar allies at home and abroad. But first, let's go show Argos who's boss. In 494 BC, Sparta and friends marched to Argos and defeat the Argives at the Battle of Sapphea, and the city would never challenge Spartan dominance again. Tyrants and enemies of Greece beware. Oh, but wait a second. 494 BC, that's just 4 years before the Battle of Marathon. Because while Sparta considers itself the true champion of the Hellenes, while keeping one eye on its slaves, there was another polis becoming a powerful contender for that title. In fact, they're so confident in their abilities that they just agreed to help the subjugated Ionian Greeks. Surely they're not going to pick a fight with the Persian Empire. Oh, they just burned down Sardis. Oh, that's not good. Well, not Sparta's problem. Little city-states shouldn't play with matches, right, Athens? But before we get to that, we'll be taking a look at the early days of that magnificent city, before the Parthenon, before democracy, before they decided it was a good idea to challenge the strongest force in the world. So join me next time as we discuss Athens on the podcast History of Our World. To learn more about the ancient Greek music performed by Gregorio Paniagua and his musicians, visit harmoniamundi.com. Support their hard work by purchasing the album from iTunes, Amazon, or from wherever you get your music.